Lysander continues Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. The treasured chamber of the Acanthians at Delphi has this inscription: the spoils which Brasidas and the Acanthians took from the Athenians. And accordingly many take the marble statue which stands within the building by the gates to be Brasidas's, but indeed it is Lysander's, representing him with his hair at full length after the old fashion and with an ample beard. Neither is it true, as some give out, that because the Argives, after their great defeat, shaved themselves from sorrow, that the Spartans, contrariwise, triumphing in their achievements, suffered their hair to grow. Neither did the Spartans come to be ambitious of wearing long hair, because the Bacchiada, who fled from Corinth to Lacedaemon, looked mean and unsightly, having their heads all close cut. But this also is indeed of the ordinances of Lycurgus, who, as it is reported, was used to say that long hair made good-looking men more beautiful and ill-looking men more terrible. Lysander's father is said to have been Aristocletus, who was not indeed of the royal family, but yet of the stock of the Heraclida. He was brought up in poverty and showed himself obedient and conformable, as ever anyone did, to the customs of his country, of a manly spirit also, and superior to all pleasures, excepting only that which their good actions bring to those who are honored and successful, and it accounted no base thing in Sparta for their young men to be overcome with this kind of pleasure, for they are desirous from the very first to have their youth susceptible to good and bad repute, to feel pain at disgrace, and exultation at being commended, and any one who is insensible and unaffected in these respects is thought poor-spirited, and of no capacity for virtue. Ambition and the passion for distinction were thus implanted in his character by his Laconian education. Nor, if they continued there, must we blame his natural disposition much for this, but he was submissive to great men beyond what seemed agreeable to the Spartan temper, and could easily bear the haughtiness of those who were in power when it was any way for his advantage, says. There's a reason for going along, which some are of opinion is no small part of political discretion. Aristotle, who says all great characters are more or less atrabilios, as Socrates and Plato and Hercules were. Atrabilius, as Socrates and Plato and Hercules were, writes that Lysander, not indeed early in life, but when he was old, became thus affected. What is singular in his character is that he endured poverty very well, and that he was not at all enslaved or corrupted by wealth, and yet he filled his country with riches and the love of them. He took away from them the glory of not admiring money, importing amongst them an abundance of gold and silver after the Athenian war, though keeping not one drachma for himself, when Dionysius, the tyrant, sent his daughters some costly gowns of Sicilian manufacture, he would not receive them, saying, He was afraid they would make them look more unhandsome. But a while after, being sent ambassador from the same city to the same tyrant, when he had sent him a couple of robes, and bade him choose which of them he would, and carry to his daughter. She, said he, will be able to choose best for herself, and taking both of them, went his way. The Peloponnesian War, having now been carried on a long time, and it being expected, after the disaster of the Athenians in Sicily, that they would at once lose the mastery of the sea, and ere long be routed everywhere. Alcibiades, returning from banishment, and taking the command, produced a great change, and made the Athenians again a match for their opponents by sea, and the Lacedaemonians, in great alarm at this, and calling up fresh courage and zeal for conflict, feeling the want of an able commander and of a powerful armament, sent out Lysander to be admiral of the seas. Being at Ephesus, and finding the city well affected towards him, and favorable to the Lacedaemonian party, but in ill condition, and in danger to become barbarized by adopting the manners of the Persians, who were much mingled among them, the country of Lydia bordering upon them, and the king's generals being quartered there for a long time, he pitched his camp there, and commanded the merchant ships all about to put in thither, and proceed to build ships of war there, and thus restored the ports by the traffic he created, and their market by employment he gave, and filled their private houses and their workshops with wealth, so that from that time the city began, first of all, by Lysander's means, to have some hopes of growing to that stateliness and grandeur which now it is at, understanding that Cyrus, the king's son, who came to Sardis, he went up to talk with him, and to accuse Tissaphernes, who, receiving a command to help the Lacedaemonians and to drive the Athenians from the sea, was thought, on account of Alcibiades, to have become remiss and unwilling, and by paying the seamen slenderly, to be ruining the fleet. Now, Carus was willing that Tissaphernes might be found in blame, and be ill reported of, as being indeed a dishonest man, and privately at feud with himself. By these means, and by their daily intercourse together, Lysander, especially by the submissiveness of his conversation, won the affection of the young prince, and greatly roused him to carry on the war. And when he would depart, Carus gave him a banquet, and desired him not to refuse his good will, but to speak and ask whatever he had a mind to, and that he should not be refused anything whatsoever. Since you are so very kind, replied Lysander, I earnestly request you to add 1 penny to the seaman's pay, that instead of the 3 pence, they may now receive 4 pence. Cyrus, delighted with his public spirit, he gave them 10,000 darics, out of which he added the penny to the seaman's pay, and by the renown of this, in a short time, emptied the ships of the enemies. As many would come over to that side which gave the most pay, and those who remained, being disheartened and mutinous, daily created trouble to the captains. Yet for all Lysander had so distracted and weakened his enemies, he was afraid to engage by sea. Alcibiades, being an energetic commander, and having the superior number of ships, and having been hitherto in all battles unconquered, both by sea and land. But afterwards, when Alcibiades sailed from Samos to Phocaea, leaving Antiochus, the pilot, in command of all his forces, this Antiochus, to insult Lysander, sailed with 2 galleys into the port of the Ephesians, and with mocking and laughter proudly rowed along before the place where the ships lay drawn up. Lysander, in indignation, launched at first a few ships only, and pursued him, but as soon as he saw the Athenians come to his help, he added some other ships, and at last they fell to a set battle together, and Lysander won the victory, and taking 15 of their ships, erected a trophy. For this, the people in the city being angry, put Alcibiades out of command, and finding himself despised by the soldiers in Samos, and ill spoken of, he sailed from the army into the Chersonese, and this battle, although not important in itself, was made remarkable by its consequences to Alcibiades. Lysander, meanwhile, invited to Ephesus such persons in the various cities as he saw to be bolder and haughtier spirited than the rest, promised to lay the foundations of that government by bodies of 10, and those revolutions which afterwards came to pass, stirring up and urging them to unite in clubs and applying themselves to public affairs, since as soon as ever the Athenians should be put down, the popular government, he said, should be suppressed, and they should become supreme in their several countries. And he made them believe these things by present deeds, promoting those that were his friends already to great employments, honors, and offices, and to gratify their covetousness, making himself a partner in injustice and wickedness, so much so that all flocked to him and courted and desired him, hoping, if he remained in power, that the highest wishes they could form would all be gratified, and therefore, from the very beginning, they could not look pleasantly upon Callicratidas when he came to succeed Lysander as admiral, nor afterwards, when he had given them experience that he was a most noble and just person, were they pleased with the manner of his government and its straightforward Dorian honest character. They did, indeed, admire his virtue, as they might the beauty of some hero's image, but their wishes were for Lysander's zealous and profitable support of the interests of his friends and partisans, and they shed tears and were much disheartened when he sailed from them. He himself made them yet more disaffected to Callicratidas. For what remained of the money which had been given him to pay the navy, he sent back again to Sardes, bidding them, if they would apply to Callicratidas, himself, and see how he was able to maintain the soldiers, and at the last, sailing away, he declared to him that he delivered up the fleet in possession and command of the sea, but Callicratidas, to expose the emptiness of these high pretensions, said, in that case, leave Samos on the left hand, and sailing to Miletus, there deliver up the ships to me, for if we are masters of the sea, we need not fear sailing by our enemies in Samos. To which Lysander answering that not himself, but he commanded the ships, sailed to Peloponnesus, leaving Callicratidas in great perplexity, for neither had he brought any money from home with him, nor could he endure to tax the towns or force them, being in hardship enough. Therefore the only course that was to be taken was to go and beg at the doors of the king's commanders, as Lysander had done, for which he was most unfit of any man, being of a generous and great spirit, and one who thought it more becoming for the Greeks to suffer any damage from one another than to flatter and wait at the gates of barbarians, who indeed had gold enough, but nothing else that was commendable. But being compelled by necessity, he proceeded to Lydia, and went at once to Carus's house, and sent in word that Callicratidas the admiral was there to speak with him. One of those who kept the gates replied, "Carus, O stranger, is it not now at leisure? Carus, O stranger, is not now at leisure, for he is drinking." To which Callicratidas answered most innocently, "Very well, I will wait till he has done his draught." This time, therefore, they took him for some clownish fellow, and withdrew, merely laughed at by the barbarians. But when, afterwards, he came a second time to the gate, and was not admitted, he took it hardly, and set off for Ephesus, wishing a great many evils to those who first let themselves be insulted over by these barbarians, and taught them to be insolent because of their riches, and added vows to those who were present, that as soon as ever he came back to Sparta, he would do all he could to reconcile the Greeks, that they might be formidable to one another. But Callicratidas, who entertained purposes worthy a Lacedaemonian, showed himself worthy to compete with the very best of Greece for his justice, his greatness of mind and courage. Not long after, having been beaten in a sea fight at Arginusa, died. And now, affairs going backwards, the associates in the war sent an embassy to Sparta, requiring Lysander to be their admiral, professing themselves ready to undertake the business much more zealously if he was commander. And Carus also sent to request the same thing, but because they had a law which would not suffer anyone to be admiral twice, and wished nevertheless to gratify their allies, they gave the title of admiral to one Gracchus, and sent Lysander nominally as vice admiral, but indeed with full powers. So he came out, long wished for by the greatest part of their chief persons and leaders in the towns, who hoped to grow to greater power still by his means, when the popular governments should be everywhere destroyed. But to those who loved honest and noble behavior in their commanders, Lysander, compared with Callicratidas, seemed cunning and subtle, managing most things in the war by deceit, extolling what was just when it was profitable, and when it was not, using that which was convenient instead of that which was good, and not judging truth to be in nature better than falsehood, but setting a value upon both according to interest. He would laugh at those who thought Hercules's posterity ought not to use deceit in war, for where the lion's skin will not reach, you must patch it out with the fox's. Such is the conduct recorded of him in the business about Miletus, for when his friends and connections, whom he had promised to assist in suppressing popular government and expressing their political opponents, had altered their minds and were reconciled to their enemies, he pretended openly as if he was pleased with it, and was desirous to further the reconciliation, but privately he railed at and abused them, and provoked them to set upon the multitude. And as soon as ever he perceived a new attempt to be commencing, he at once came up and entered into the city, and the first of the conspirators he lit upon he pretended to rebuke, and spoke roughly, as if he would punish them. But the others, meantime, he bade be courageous, and to fear nothing. Now he was with them, and all his acting and dissembling was with the object that the most considerable men of the popular party might not fly away, but might stay in the city and be killed, which so felt out, for all who believed him were put to death. There is a saying also recorded by Androclides, which makes him guilty of the great indifference to the obligations of an oath. His recommendation, according to this account, was to cheat boys with dice and men with oaths, an imitation of Polycrates of Samos, not very honorable to a lawful commander. To take example, namely, from a tyrant, nor in character with Iconian usages, to treat what are considered to be gods and goddesses as ill as enemies, or indeed even more injuriously, since he who overreaches by an oath admits that he fears his enemy, while he despises his god. Now, whether it's a divinized hero of some sort, whether it's some supernatural being, even if the cult per se is one's enemy, it's not, you don't blaspheme what other people hold to, or they're going to blaspheme you, right? But there's a reason, a whole bunch of reasons why revealed religion, as people will call it, forbids in this era games of chance. It's not just gambling and stuff like this. It's it opens up a mentality towards Carus now sent for Lysander to Sardis, and gave him some money, and promised him some more, youthfully protesting in favor to him that if his father gave him nothing, he would supply him of his own, and if he himself should be destitute of all, he would cut up, he said, to make money, the very throne upon which he sat to do justice, it being made of gold and silver. And at last, going up into Media to his father, he ordered that he should receive the tribute of the towns, and committed his government to him. And so taking his leave, and desiring him not to fight by sea before he returned, for he would come back with a great many ships out of Phoenicia and Cilicia, departed to visit the king. Lysander's ships were too few for him to venture to fight, and yet too many to allow of his remaining idle. And he set out, therefore, and reduced some of the islands, and wasted Aegina and Salamis, and from thence, landing in Attica, and saluting Agis, who came from Decelea to meet him, and he made a display of the land forces, of the strength of the fleet, as though he could sail where he pleased, and were absolute master by sea. But hearing the Athenians pursued him, he fled another way through the island into Asia, and finding the Hellespont without any defense, he attacked Lampsacus with his ships by sea, while Thorax, acting in concert with him, with the land army, made an assault on the walls, and, so having taken the city by storm, he gave it up to his soldiers to plunder. The fleet of the Athenians, 180 ships, had just arrived at Elaus in the Chersonese, and, hearing the news that Lampsacus was destroyed, they presently sailed to Sestos, where, taking in victuals, they advanced to Argos, Potami, over against their enemies, who were still stationed about Lampsacus. Amongst other Athenian captains who were now in command was Philocles, he who persuaded the people to pass a decree to cut off the right thumb of the captives in the war, that they should not be able to hold the spear, though they might the oar. Then they all rested themselves, hoping they should have battle the next morning. But Lysander had other things in his head. He commanded the mariners and pilots to go on board at dawn, as if there should be a battle as soon as it was day, and to sit there in order, and without any noise, accepting what should be commanded, and in like manner that the land army should remain quietly in their ranks by sea. But the sun rising, and the Athenians sailing up with their whole fleet in line and challenging them to battle, though he had his ships all drawn up and manned before daybreak, nevertheless did not stir. He merely sent some boats to those who lay foremost, and bade them keep still and stay in their order, not to be disturbed, and none of them to set sail and offer battle. So about evening the Athenians, sailing back, he would not let the seamen go out of the ships before 2 or 3, which he had sent to espy, were returned after seeing the enemies disembark, and thus they did the next day, and the third, and so did the fourth. So the Athenians grew extremely confident, and disdained their enemies, as if they had been afraid and daunted. At this time Alcibiades, who was in his castle in Chersonese, came on horseback to the Athenian army, and found fault with their captains. First of all, that they had pitched their camp, neither well nor safely, on an exposed and open beach, a very bad landing for the ships, and secondly, that where they were, they had to fetch all they wanted from Sestos, some considerable way off, whereas if they sailed round a little way to the town and harbor of Sestos, they would be at a safer distance from the enemy, who lay watching their movements at the command of a single general, terror of whom made every order rapidly executed. This advance, however, they would not listen to, and Tadius answered disdainfully that not he, but others, were in office now. So Alcibiades, who even suspected there must be treachery, departed. But on the 5th day the Athenians, having sailed towards them, and gone back again, as they were used to do, very proudly and full of contempt, Lysander, sending some ships as usual to look out, commanded the masters of them, that when they saw the Athenians go to land, they should row back again with all their speed, and that when they were about halfway across, they should lift up a brazen shield from the foredeck as the sign of battle, and he himself sailed round, encouraged the pilots and masters of the ships, and exhorted them to keep all their men to their places, seamen and soldiers alike, and as soon as ever the sign should be given, to row boldly to their enemies. Accordingly, when the shield had been lifted up from the ships, and the trumpet from the admiral's vessel had sounded for the battle, the ships rowed up, and the foot soldiers strove to get along by the shore to the promontory. The distance there between the two continents is 15 furlongs, which, by the zeal and eagerness of the rowers, was quickly traversed. Cannon, one of the Athenian commanders, was the first who saw from the land the fleet advancing, and shouted out to embark. and in the greatest distress made some and entreated others, and some he forced to man the ships. But all his diligence signified nothing, because the men were scattered about. For as soon as they came out of the ships, expecting no such matter, some went to market, others walked about the country, or went to sleep in their tents, or got their dinners ready, being, through their commanders' want of skill, as far as possible from any thought of what was to happen. And the enemy now coming up with shouts and noise, Cannon with 8 ships sailed out, and making his escape, passed from thence to Cyprus, to Evagoras. The Peloponnesians, falling upon the rest, some they took quite empty, and some they destroyed while they were filling. The men, meantime, coming unarmed and scattered to help, died at their ships, or flying by land were slain, their enemies disembarking and pursuing them. Lysander took 3,000 prisoners, with the generals and the whole fleet, excepting the sacred ship Paralus, and those which fled with Cannon. So taking their ships in a tow, and having plundered their tents, with pipe and songs of victory, he sailed back to Lampsacus, having accomplished a great work with small pains, and having finished in 1 hour a war which had been protracted in its continuance, and diversified in its incidents, and in its fortunes, to a degree exceeding belief, compared with all before it, after altering its shape and character 1,000 times, and after having been the destruction of more commanders than all the previous wars of Greece put together, it was now put an end to by the good counsel and ready conduct of one man. Some, therefore, looked upon the result of it as a divine intervention, and there were certain who affirmed that the stars of Castor and Pollux were seen on each side of Lysander's ship when he first set sail from the haven toward his enemies, shining about the helm, and some say the stone which fell down was a sign of this slaughter. Well, he positioned things right. Depends on which ship in the harbor, right? For a stone of a great size did fall, according to the common belief, from heaven at Agas Pateme, which is shown to this day, and held in great esteem by the Personites. And it is said that Anaxagoras foretold that the occurrence of a ship or shake, the occurrence of a slip or shake among the bodies fixed in the heavens, dislodged any one of them, would be followed by the fall of the whole of them. For no one of the stars is now in the same place in which it was at first, for they, being, according to him, like stones and heavy, shine by the refraction of the upper air round about them, and are carried along forcibly by the violence of the circular motion by which they were originally withheld from falling, when cold and heavy bodies were first separated from the general universe. This is why you have to be careful with your speculations, because it can take down a whole mythology. But there is a more probable opinion than this, maintained by some who say that falling stars are no effluxes, nor discharges of ethereal fire, extinguished almost at the instant of its igniting by the lower air, neither are they the sudden combustion and blazing up of a quantity of the lower air let loose in great abundance into the upper region, but the heavenly bodies, by a relaxation of the force of their circular movement, are carried by an irregular course. Well, from our perspective, some of these things can be irregular. There is no retrograde motion, for example. Not in general into the inhabited part of the earth, but for the most part into the wide sea, which is the cause of their not being observed. Daimachus, in his treatise on religion, supports the view of Anaxagoras. He says that before the stone fell for 75 days, continually, there was seen in the heavens a vast fiery body, as if it had been a flaming cloud, not resting, but carried about with several intricate and broken movements, so that the flaming pieces, which were broken off by this commotion and running about, were carried in all directions, shining as falling stars do. Oh, comet, obviously. But when it afterwards came down to the ground in this district, and the people of the place, recovering from their fear and astonishment, came together, there was no fire to be seen, neither any sign of it. There was only a stone lying, big indeed, but which bore no proportion to speak of to that fiery compass. It is manifest that Daimachus needs to have indulgent hearers, but if what he says be true, he altogether proves those to be wrong who say that a rock broken off from the top of some mountain by winds and tempests and caught and whirled about like a top, as soon as this impetus begins to slacken and cease, was precipitated, that fell to the ground, unless indeed we chose to say that the phenomenon which was observed for so many days was really fire, and that the change in the atmosphere ensuing on its extinction was extended with violent winds and agitations, which might be the cause of this stone being carried off. The exacter treatment of this subject belongs, however, to a different kind of writing. Lysander, after the 3,000 Athenians whom he had taken prisoners were condemned by the commissioners to die, called Theodocles the general, and asked him what punishment he considered himself to deserve for having advised the citizens as he had done against the Greeks, but he, being nothing cast down at his calamity, bade him not to accuse him of matters of which nobody was a judge, but to do to him now he was a conqueror, as he would have suffered had he been overcome. Then, washing himself and putting on a finer cloak, he led the citizens the way to the slaughter, as Theophrastus writes in his history. Now, it's possible that something broke off a comet or something, but it's even more possible that, if it's breaking off pieces into the atmosphere, that, just burnt up, really.